4 innocent people are murdered in a small Florida business.
All victims were shot execution style, in the back of the head at close range.
He's got to be a monster. To do all the things that he did, shot him in the head.
Police find no weapons, no fingerprints, and no clues.
It was simply an unknown whodunit.
Cracking the case would take a task force.
It was our priority to use every resource available.
The Erie Massacre, next. Wednesday, December 3rd, 1997. Evening descends on the small central Florida town of Bartow. Known for its towering oak trees and easy living, residents here rarely worry about crime. But as the town settles in for the evening, in the nearby home of 35-year-old Frank Dasso, an uneasy feeling grips his wife.
She knew when he was not home by 6 that there was something wrong.
Frank's twin daughters were celebrating their 10th birthday. He promised his wife he would be home from his job at the Erie manufacturing plant in time for the party.
He was so dependable, and he was the kind of father and husband who was going to do what he said he was going to do. If he was going to be home by a certain time, he was going to be home.
Frank isn't the only one late. His sister Diane and her husband, George Patiso, who also worked at the plant, haven't arrived either. Worried, Phil and Nicoletta Dasso, Frank and Diane's parents, decide to stop by Erie to check on the holdup. Inside, they make a grisly discovery. Phil Dasso calls 911.
911 emergency.
My daughter! Oh my God! Stor! God, I know what happened.
You know, I was screaming. I was going crazy in the shop. I was going crazy. My wife, she's all over my daughter. She's screaming. She was screaming her head off.
Diane Patiso's body was discovered by her mother. You can hear her, screaming and crying in the background as Mr. Dasso places a 911 call.
Stay on the phone with me.
Phil quickly searches the rest of the building and stumbles upon a slaughter.
What's the problem? What's going on?
I don't know. 3 dead people in there. Stop, shop. Oh my God!
Stor!
Phil's son, Frank Dasso, his partner, George Gonsalves, and his son-in-law, George Patiso, are found shot to death in an office.
My son-in-law, and my partner, they're all dead. Oh my God! God, I know what happened.
Police officers from the town of Bartow are first on the scene. They call in the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Detective Tommy Ray leads the crime scene investigation.
The first office to the right is where all 3 other victims were found.
It was an apparent murder scene. All 4 individuals appeared to have died from gunshot wounds.
It was one of the most horrific crimes Bartow had ever witnessed, and by night, word of it had spread through town. Police and residents worry it is a gangland killing.
Occasionally we'll have a murder or 2 a year, but we've never had crimes like this where 4 people were murdered. It's a town where you can normally feel safe walking around day or night, and it's just not the type of town you would expect something like this to happen in.
It definitely sent shockwaves across this county early on, because nobody knew whether or not this was a deliberate act or whether it was something that had been planned out, that this family, this group at Erie had just been targeted for one reason or another.
Erie Manufacturing was a small family business that made conveyor systems for department stores and dry cleaners. Phil Dasso and his best friend, George Gonsalves, started the company more than 25 years ago. In the last year, business was booming.
The business was definitely flourishing and doing well and making a profit.
At first glance, the crime scene looks like a robbery. Desk drawers are emptied, and there's paper everywhere. but investigators quickly rule it out.
Any robbery I can ever remember was somewhere that had cash. People are out seeking to rob for cash that they can readily use for their purposes. This place had no cash.
Then they find a puzzling clue.
This area here, there was a vinyl blue chair that had shoe impressions, and just above the chair, there was a lifted ceiling tile. Like someone had stepped in the chair and then maybe stepped onto the desk and removed something from the ceiling tile.
Over the next 24 hours, forensic specialists comb the crime scene. Investigators hope to find DNA, blood, or hair samples that will lead them to the killer or killers. No weapons are found, but investigators do recover a dozen spent bullet casings.
There were 12 shell casings, 11 .22, and one .32 shell casing from a semi-automatic.
All 12 casings are from bullets used on the victims.
Frank Dasso has wounds to the side of his head as well as wounds to his left arm. That indicates that perhaps he has his arms up in a defensive type posture when the wound is inflicted.
All three men were shot execution style with a .22 caliber gun.
Execution style means be shot in the back of the head at close range. That's exactly what happened with all four of the victims.
George Gonzalez has a wound to the back of his head as well as to the side of his head as well.
Diane Petiso was the only exception.
Diane was shot with two different type weapons. There were probably two gunmen. One had shot her with the .32. That was the first shot. And then the shooter who had shot all three of the other victims with the .22 used the same .22 to come shoot Diane to make sure, that she was in fact dead.
For investigators, the evidence points in one direction.
The execution style nature of the shootings, the actual wounds that were inflicted, each victim shot behind the left ear. That suggests somebody at least very cold, which hitmen are.
The initial thoughts were this was a hired hit, a contract killing.
If this was a hit, a gangland killing, the question for investigators is why? They turn to the victims for answers. Phil's son, Frank Dasso, had been with the company several years. He was the business manager and a devoted father of three young girls.
Frank, he can be no better kid. I'm telling you, I think I'm proud of all my three kids that I have.
Phil's daughter, Diane Dasso Petiso, age 28, was making a name for herself as a prosecutor.
Diane was the most lovely person that you can meet. She's happened to be a very smart girl. She got a scholarship for law. She helped everybody she can.
Diane was married to George Petiso. They were still newlyweds and had moved from New York to be with Diane's family. George was learning the ropes at the company and worked there just 5 months. The fourth victim, George Gonzalez, had been Phil Dasso's friend and business partner for 25 years.
George Gonzalez was married. His wife's name is Eno, and he has 3 children. He was very dedicated to his family. He was very dedicated to Eno, and she was very dependent on him.
This is where George Petiso and George Gonzalez was lying, right at the doorway, like they were attempting to get out. Over here is where Frank Dasso was found.
Detectives zero in on Diane Dasso Petiso. Her career as a prosecutor could suggest a motive.
Diane Dasso Petiso, who was an assistant state attorney, she had worked misdemeanor cases.
She was a very strong, aggressive prosecutor in talking with people who had worked with her up in New York. When she came down here, she hired on with the state attorney's office, and she really went after the cases that she prosecuted.
There might be something involved where someone was out to get her because she might have prosecuted them or she prosecuted a member of their family or whatever, a revenge motive or something associated with her position.
Detectives examined Diane's cases in New York and Florida, looking for possible suspects. They question her co-workers. Investigators conclude Diane Dasso Petiso is a victim of circumstance, simply and tragically at the wrong place at the wrong time.
It seemed obvious that the last person killed was killed as an afterthought or because she walked in on something.
Diane was found here. She had been shot twice, once with a 32, once with a 22. And her front part of her body was lying into the hallway here with her legs out here. She still had her car keys in her hand.
Investigators believe the gunman might have known Diane Petiso.
And if you are somebody hired or from out of town, why do you kill Diane? She's never going to be able to identify you if you're a hitman. Why didn't you run down the hallway past her?
With no weapons and no eyewitnesses, investigators hope the results of crime scene lab tests will give them something, anything, to go on.
I did a complete inventory of what was submitted. I then did a visual exam of the items of evidence, and there were no latent prints visible. There were no subjects identified.
Officers begin interviewing current and former employees of Erie Manufacturing.
Law enforcement talked to everybody in the business to see if there were any disgruntled employees, another just normal avenue of investigation.
Investigators also canvass the area in and around the industrial site, looking for possible witnesses.
Actually, we had one of the workers that worked down the street actually gave us a composite of someone that he saw standing out in front of the business the day of the homicides.
Still struggling for a lead, the task force digs into the business affairs of Erie Manufacturing.
It didn't take long to find out that one of the former partners had been ousted from the business.
The business originally had 3 partners: Phil Dasso, George Gonsalves, and a man named Nelson Serrano. Nelson was the president of Erie, and a paradox.
Nelson was a very generous man. When someone needed his help, be it financial, be it his time, be it just his support, he was right there.
But people at Erie saw a different side of him.
George and Nelson just did not get along. They were both hot-headed. All of the investigation that we did revealed that Phil Dasso was the peacemaker of this partnership of 3 men.
The conflict in the partnership wasn't just about personalities. Phil Dasso and George Gonsalves had discovered that Nelson Serrano was stealing from the company.
And they find out that there's $47,000. 2 different checks had come into the business that Nelson Serrano had taken and deposited into a separate account that neither one of the other 2 partners had any knowledge of. So they oust him, and he's kicked out of the business. So he goes from making almost $1 million a year to making nothing.
Nelson Serrano's son, Francisco, was also kicked out of the company.
Francisco Serrano, who was the bookkeeper, he was refusing to let Phil Dasso and George Gonsalves, his father's partners, in looking at the books. Francisco gets terminated. He's fired from the business, so he's out of there.
Both Serranos became persons of interest in the investigation. When Francisco is questioned, he has an airtight alibi.
One of his friends actually called the police department to vouch for him, like out of the blue.
Saying that Francisco was with him in Tampa at a place called Specialty Cars.
Francisco Serrano was excluded. He wasn't there when these people were shot.
Francisco's father, Nelson Serrano, was also out of town the night of the murder. He was 600 miles away in Atlanta on a business trip.
When he was contacted, he came back to Bartow, and he came in the next day and said that he was in Atlanta, that he had a migraine headache, that he was in the La Quinta Motor Inn in his motel room.
The task force sends investigators to the La Quinta Inn in Atlanta to verify the alibi.
We obtained the video from the La Quinta for the time period surrounding the homicides, day before, day of, day after. Reviewed the video, and he is indeed on the video several times.
Nelson Serrano may have had a motive, but his alibi checks out. And there's no physical evidence linking him to the murders.
There was no DNA, no bloody fingerprints or anything like that we could tie to a suspect at that point. No hair, fiber, so we're still stuck with, a motive, but no means.
When you don't have any eyewitnesses and you don't have any forensic evidence, clearly it didn't seem to be a robbery, you're in for a long investigation.
Investigators are stumped. They go back over their evidence, searching for the missing piece of the puzzle. And then they find it, the overlooked clue that will ultimately break the case wide open. 2 weeks have passed since the execution-style murders of Diane Dasso Petiso, George Petiso, Frank Dasso, and George Gonsalves in the offices of the Erie Manufacturing Company in Central Florida. The prime suspects, ousted business partner Nelson Serrano and his son Francisco, have solid alibis, and no physical evidence was left at the crime scene. Investigators fear the case is going cold.
And having worked cold cases, that's one thing. You run into a lot of dead ends, but you don't stop, you just keep going. And eventually, you're going to find that piece of the puzzle that you need to bring the case to a conclusion.
Digging for clues, Special Agent Ray re-interviews Nelson Serrano.
You could pick up the hatred in his voice that he still had for a former partner that was murdered. Nelson Serrano's a guy that had spent, at least 10 years with the company. He knew Phil Dasso's kids and George Gonsalves' kids. They used to socialize together. So you could tell there was the hatred there.
Investigation of homicide of multiple victims. Final statement was taken from Nelson Serrano.
Then, Agent Ray reviews the first interview of Nelson Serrano, conducted the day after the murders. A statement he made about Diane Dasso Petiso suddenly jumps out.
Because she comes every day to pick him up. Okay. And I assumed myself and said maybe she walked in the middle of something.
Okay. Those were his words. He said that Diane obviously must have walked in on something.
The key thing to me was that Diane walked in the middle of something.
In the middle of something?
That wasn't released to any of the media. How would he know unless he was there? Because she did walk in the middle of something.
But on the day of the murders, Serrano was 600 miles away in Atlanta, Georgia.
Nelson's alibi was that he had a meeting in Atlanta that morning, came back into the hotel, and went straight to bed and didn't get out of bed. Stayed there all night till the next morning when he left to come back to Florida.
Investigators decide to take a second look at the hotel surveillance tape.
We had found that Nelson is on the hotel video at 12:20 p.m. in Atlanta. Well, we discovered later on, after going back through videotapes again, that Nelson reappears on the videotape on the day of the homicide at 10:17 p.m. So there's a 9-hour and 57-minute gap from the time that he's seen on it till he's seen again.
Ray now believes Nelson Serrano had both the time and the motive to commit the murders. Serrano and his family and associates become the new focus of the investigation. But the task force still has no incriminating physical evidence. investigators realize they are in for a long haul.
We had tons of telephone numbers, telephone records from various people, some suspects. Then we would go for the financial records, everybody's credit cards.
Between January 1998 and June 2000, numerous state and federal grand juries are convened to examine evidence. At the center of their investigation, calls between Nelson Serrano and his nephew, Alvaro Peñarera. Finally, investigators begin to connect the dots.
When we checked the day of the homicide, we had found that Nelson Serrano had called his nephew like at 8:03 a.m. The next phone call was a call made by Alvaro to Dollar Car Rental there in Orlando.
Alvaro rented a Nissan 200 SX in Orlando on the day of the murders and turned it in the next day in Tampa. Had he rented it for himself or his uncle, and why?
So, that sent up all kind of red flags.
They put Alvaro under surveillance.
We have a time-lapse camera taking pictures of people coming and going at Alvaro's apartment.
Investigators search Nelson Serrano's house. They find nearly 30 firearms, mostly 22 and 32 caliber guns. On June 15th, 2000, they turn up the heat. Nelson Serrano is arrested for grand theft for the $250,000 checks he deposited without his partner's knowledge 3 years prior.
I subpoenaed Nelson Serrano, his wife, his son, his nephews to the grand jury. The whole thought was to arrest Nelson on the grand theft, but make everyone else think that he's being arrested on the murder.
On the same day, Agent Ray brings nephew Alvaro Peñarera in for questioning.
His initial response was that he didn't do it, doesn't know anything about it. I said, I'm talking about a car rental. He goes, oh, I rented the car for a friend of mine. And he makes up the name of some friend. And I said, well, let's call him on the telephone. Well, I don't remember his number.
He finally came clean and told us that his uncle asked him to rent the car for him.
Alvaro breaks down and says, okay, my uncle told me that he wanted the car to meet his Brazilian girlfriend.
Investigators quickly dismiss the Brazilian mistress story. They believe that Nelson Serrano somehow used the rental car to get from Atlanta back to Florida.
I'm positive, and we're positive at that point, that Nelson Serrano returned and committed the homicides himself.
Ray and investigators now need some evidence that confirms their theory. That during a 10-hour window, Nelson Serrano went from Atlanta to Florida and back the day of the murders.
We had a problem. We checked every possible flight manifest during that time period. We even checked as far as private jets.
There is no record of Serrano on any of the flights. Then, investigators get a break. In February 2001, Special Agent Ray visits with Phil and Nicoletta Dasso. Something Phil says sends off alarm bells.
During that conversation, Mr. Dasso stated that one time he was told by Nelson years earlier that Nelson had a illegitimate kid. His name was Juan Carlos Serrano. But when Wanda checked the birth record of Juan Carlos Serrano, the mother's maiden name was Agacio.
Ray suddenly realizes that Serrano may have used an alias to fly in and out of Florida.
Wanda checked that with the flight manifest, and bingo. We got a Juan Agacio that flew in and would have landed in Orlando. Perfect time. I think it's 2:49 p.m.
We discovered that the airline ticket was purchased with cash. The return trip was not used.
A check of the Tampa airport turns up another suspicious ticket. This one to Atlanta in the name of John White.
The one for John White. purchased the same way, with cash, return trip, unused, during the time frame that he could make it back to Atlanta.
Investigators now believe they know how Nelson Serrano got in and out of Florida the day of the murders. They theorize that Serrano, using the name Juan Agasio, flew from Atlanta to Orlando, Florida, and picked up a rental car. He returned the car in Tampa. Using a different alias, he then flew from Tampa back to Atlanta. But they can't prove it.
We've still had a lot of work to do, but we've got something here. We're on the right track.
Investigators present all the new evidence to State Attorney John Aguero and his team. They lay out the phone calls, the rental car records, the airline tickets purchased with cash under assumed names, everything that points to Nelson Serrano as the killer.
And he's like, "You're close, but you're not there. You've got a ways to go."
When they come to us with a case, we want to be able to look at the evidence they have and feel comfortable that we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, not just probable cause.
Investigators are frustrated. Nelson Serrano is in their sights, and they have a room full of smoke. But where's the smoking gun? 3 years after the murder of 4 people in a small family business in Central Florida, investigators have a suspect in their sights. Nelson Serrano, the former business partner of one of the victims.
You know, it's like you just know you're getting a little bit closer, a little bit closer. You know, you're starting to put pieces of the puzzle together.
But the state's attorney says that investigators still don't have enough to take the case to court.
When they come to us with a case, we want to be able to look at the evidence they have and feel comfortable that we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, not just probable cause.
Tom Ray tries a new approach. He reasons that if Serrano used a rental car to get to and from Florida airports, he must have parked it somewhere. If he parked in an airport lot, a ticket would have been issued. Investigators head to the airports to look for old parking tickets.
And we go through those tickets one by one, and there were thousands of tickets. But we knew the time frame, and they were set up sequential order.
Then, investigators hit pay dirt.
Bingo. We find the ticket for the rental car. There was a tag of the rental car, PEV 23V. That was a 2000 Nissan that Alvaro Pinarera had rented for Nelson.
The ticket is from the airport parking lot in Orlando and is stamped December 3rd, the day of the killings. And there's more. Investigators also find evidence that Serrano's own car was parked at the same Florida airport the day the airline tickets were bought with cash.
We went to November the 23rd when the tickets were purchased, and we found Nelson Serrano's tag on that parking ticket.
Investigators submit the parking tickets to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Lynn Ernst examines them and discovers a print on the Serrano ticket.
I compared the latent fingerprint on the parking ticket to the known standard that was submitted bearing the name of Nelson Serrano. I looked at the pattern itself and the flow of the ridges. I then looked at individual characteristics, and I determined that it was one and the same.
So it's like, you know, bingo, this is fantastic. You know, it's kind of a high five moment, you know, for all the investigators and detectives around.
The fingerprint on the rental car parking ticket proves Nelson Serrano was in the Florida airport on December 3rd, 1997.
And the emotion was very strong. It was just elation, but there was still a lot more work to do.
Investigators can now lay out their case. They build a timeline of Serrano's activities.
He leaves a hotel in Atlanta, the airport, at 12:20 p.m. He then gets on an airplane. He's back in Orlando at 2:41 p.m. We have him at 3:49 p.m. leaving in the rental car with the ticket with his fingerprint on it. He drives to Bartow. It takes usually an hour, hour and 15 minutes.
At around 5:25 p.m., Serrano enters Erie Manufacturing.
He goes into the business. The door's left open because Diane Petiso is coming there to pick up her husband and her brother.
He walks into his old office, where he finds Frank Dosso, George Petiso, and his former partner, George Gonsalves.
As he comes into the office, I'm sure they all start approaching him. He's in the doorway, tells them to get down. As they're getting down, we feel that boom, boom. He shoots George Gonsalves and George Petiso immediately. Well, Frank Dosso is in another part of the office. He walks over and he shoots Frank behind the head.
It's at this point investigators believe that Serrano leaves his footprint on the vinyl chair. He steps up on the chair, moves a ceiling tile, and takes out a .32.
He knows that he had left a gun in a ceiling tile that he used to hide up there, according to one of the former employees.
Serrano then hears Diane enter the building.
He chases her down with a .32, and you can tell because there was hair in her hand where he must have caught her and grabbed her back of the hair because she reaches back. And in her own hand, is her hair. So he shoots her with a .32.
Serrano throws things around to make it look like a robbery. Then heads for Tampa Airport. The plane is leaving at 8:20 p.m.
That's an hour from Bartow to Tampa. He doesn't have any luggage check-in, so he gets on the flight and he's back in Atlanta at 9:49 p.m. He then is shown on the video at the hotel back there at 10:17 p.m. having coffee, talking with people like nothing occurred.
The investigator's timeline convinces the state's attorney.
We're like, yes, sir. What date do you want the grand jury on? We are ready to indict Mr. Serrano.
In May 2001, the grand jury in Bartow, Florida, indicts Nelson Serrano on 4 counts of first-degree murder.
Tommy Ray, he came to me and said, oh, they got him, they got him, they got him. Of course, everybody broke down and started crying, and I would say it was a relief a little bit anyway.
But in this investigation, nothing would be easy.
When we obtained the indictment, the problem we had, Nelson had fled to Ecuador. He had left once he found out that his nephew, Alvaro Pinarera, was cooperating with us. That's when he, got out of Dodge, so to speak.
Nelson Serrano is on the run. A Florida murder case is now an international manhunt. Three and a half years into the investigation of the Erie Manufacturing Massacre, Special Agent Tommy Ray and his team have finally gathered enough evidence to indict Nelson Serrano, but they have a new hurdle to overcome. Serrano has fled the country and is hiding in Ecuador.
That was extremely frustrating when you know who committed the worst crime in the history of your city. You know where he is, but you don't know how to get him back.
The task force begins extradition proceedings.
There are very specific rules that govern extradition. We are told you really don't have a prayer that Ecuador is going to extradite an Ecuadorian citizen.
The case begins to grow cold. Then, a lucky break.
I'm staying at the Embassy Suite Hotel. I see a sign that said International Military Intelligence Meeting.
Ray refuses to give up on the Serrano case. He strolls into the meeting and finds an Ecuadorian Army colonel.
I said, sir, if I could have about 10 minutes of your time, I really need your help. I'm working a quadruple murder, and we have a suspect who's in Quito hiding out, and we need to come up with a way to get him back to the U.S.
The colonel offers Agent Ray new hope.
He said, don't worry about what the Ecuadorian Constitution says or what they're telling you, because he may not have dual citizenship. So we obtained the provisional arrest warrant, extradition, then flew to Ecuador.
In August 2002, Ray presents the case for extradition of Nelson Serrano to the Ecuadorian authorities. At the same time, agents back in Florida are exploring other possible ways of getting Serrano out of Ecuador.
The FDLE discover that over the years, every single time Mr. Serrano has gone back and forth to the country, Ecuador has gone in and out as an American citizen. So we present that evidence to the Ecuadorian government, and they decide, okay, then he's an American citizen. You can have him.
Sympathetic Ecuadorian police officers help find Serrano. He's having dinner at a restaurant with his wife and friends when they take him down.
He was placed under arrest and taken to a holding area.
On September 1st, 2002, nearly 5 years after the crime, Nelson Serrano was returned to the U.S. He is taken to the Polk County Jail in Bartow, Florida. Investigators also need to decide whether or not to charge Nelson's nephew, Alvaro.
You got to look at him as potentially being an accomplice. He rented the car for the guy that did the killing, knowing that his uncle was going to do that.
Nelson Serrano goes on trial for murder.
Do you recognize what State's Exhibit number 209 is?
Yes, sir, I do.
A key element of their case is the surveillance video from Serrano's Atlanta motel. Prosecutors skillfully turn Serrano's alibi against him.
I argued to the jury that guy's in the same clothes. And that's how he's seen on the tape at 10-something in the morning, and that's how he's seen on at 10-something at night. And the guy says he was been in his motel room all day with a migraine headache, and he comes down to the front desk at almost 11 o'clock at night in a blazer and a turtleneck sweater? I don't think so.
Serrano's lawyers put up a spirited defense of their client.
What isn't there? The evidence will not show you a picture of Nelson Serrano going to a ticket counter to buy a ticket in the name of Mr. Ignacio.
The main defense argument was you got the wrong guy. My guy didn't do it. Somebody shot him, definitely, but not Nelson Serrano.
You'll find reasonable doubt, and at the end of this case, you will acquit Nelson Serrano because he's innocent. Thank you very much.
The trial lasts 5 weeks.
When you're waiting on that jury to file in the room, it's just burning you up inside. You're just sitting there, oh my God, I hope I did my job right. I hope they find him guilty.
You and Mr. Serrano, please stand.
The jury is out for only 6 hours.
Count 1, the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder as charged. Count 2, the defendant is guilty of first-degree. Count 3, the defendant is guilty.
When the judge read that he was guilty, 4 counts of first-degree murder, I mean, I looked over at the family members and just tears of joy. You could tell the relief and the stress taken off their face immediately.
The jury having found you
The jury recommends the death penalty for Nelson Serrano.
1, 2, 3, and 4, and on each having also found
Justice, I think, was served. He got what was coming to him.
I know you're going to get back the kids. I know that. I mean, but at least we did something for them. I mean, the justice was done. I think they deserve that. And nobody in this world has got the right to take somebody else's life.
For investigators, it's a successful end to a very tough case.
No matter how bleak a case looks, how difficult it seems to solve, if you keep plugging away, check out all the leads once, twice, maybe 3 times, eventually you'll get a successful conclusion.
For Special Agent Tommy Ray, the verdict is especially satisfying and a tribute to his stubborn perseverance.
Early on, the current agent with the FBI told me, this is going to be a career case. It may take you the rest of your career to solve this case. And, he was correct.